9 gigawatts. That's the sustained electrical output of 9 nuclear power plants, operating simultaneously, indefinitely, pointed entirely at running AI workloads. Utah just approved a campus at that scale. This is not a news recap. I'm going to break down what it actually takes to build infrastructure at this level, the power economics, the water crisis hiding in the fine print, the cooling physics that make conventional architecture impossible, the grid timelines that most analysts are completely misreading, and the capex stack that tells you who actually pays and who actually profits. Let me put 9 gigawatts in a framework that actually means something. The entire Northern Virginia data center corridor, the most densely concentrated compute real estate on the planet, operates somewhere around 4 to 5 gigawatts total today, after 2 decades of continuous build-out. This single Utah approval surpasses that entire ecosystem in one project. Current hyperscale campuses top out in the 500 megawatt to 1 gigawatt range. We're talking about a 9x step function from the current frontier of a single campus. The reason Utah is attractive isn't just cheap land and favorable tax treatment, though that's real. It's about power availability windows. Western states are still sitting on underdeveloped energy corridors from legacy industrial uses that never fully materialized. But here's what you have to understand before we go any further. The word approved is doing enormous heavy lifting in every headline about this project. Approval means planning permission and environmental sign-off at a state or a local level. It does not mean the grid infrastructure exists to support it, the water rights are secured, or the capital has been committed. Those are 3 separate problems with 3 completely separate timelines, and we're going to work through all of them. Power is the input cost that dominates everything else at this scale, so let's run the math explicitly rather than leaving it abstract. If you're operating 9 gigawatts continuously at an industrial electricity rate of 4 cents per kilowatt hour, which is roughly the low end for large Western U.S. industrial contracts, you're spending approximately $3.15 billion per year purely on electricity. At 5 cents per kilowatt hour, that's $3.9 billion annually. That is before a single dollar has been applied toward the capital cost of buildings, servers, storage, or networking. This is why the entire strategic conversation in this industry has shifted toward power purchase agreements locked at sub-4 cent rates, and why nuclear baseload is suddenly being taken seriously again by operators who previously dismissed it. An AI infrastructure provider that can lock a 20-year PPA at 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour has a structural cost advantage over any competitor paying floating market rates. The competitive mode in this industry isn't GPU architecture. It's basis points on power contracts. What's underappreciated is the load profile reality. AI inference workloads trend toward flatter, more continuous demand curves than traditional enterprise compute. A facility built for 9 gigawatts peak might sustain 70 to 80% average utilization, which still means 6 to 7 gigawatts of baseload continuous demand. Utilities find this profile highly attractive precisely because it is predictable and contractual, and it justifies the transmission capital investment that would otherwise be hard to greenlight. People fixate on power headlines and consistently underestimate the 2 physical constraints that are actually harder to solve: land and water. On land first. Modern high-density AI compute facilities run somewhere between 50 and 150 megawatts per acre in electrical load density on the server floor itself. But that's just the compute footprint. Once you account for cooling towers, transformer yards, substation pads, transmission easements, drainage infrastructure, mandatory buffer zones, and staging areas for a multi-phase build, the real land requirement per megawatt expands dramatically. A serious estimate for a 9-gigawatt campus puts the total land footprint somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 acres, depending on the cooling architecture selected. That is a land mass between 8 and 23 square miles. Now layer in water, because this is where the Utah location creates a problem the developers need to answer publicly. Utah is the second driest state in the continental United States. A conventional evaporative cooling tower setup, the industry default for large-scale facilities over the past 2 decades, consumes roughly 1.8 liters of water per kilowatt-hour of IT load removed. At 9 gigawatts of IT load running at 70% average utilization, you are potentially consuming upward of 90 to 100 million gallons of water per day. That number is not a rounding error. The Colorado River Compact is already the subject of active interstate legal disputes. Utah's allocation from that system has been contested for years. Any developer claiming to build 9 gigawatts of conventionally cooled compute in this location without demonstrated senior water rights is either planning an entirely different cooling architecture, or they have not completed this calculation. This brings us to the cooling problem, and this is where the engineering gets genuinely interesting because the industry is at a real architectural inflection point. Air cooling and evaporative towers. The architecture that built every major data center campus from roughly 2005 through 2020 cannot keep pace with the heat density of modern AI accelerators. A current generation GPU can generate 700 watts to over a kilowatt of heat in a single slot. Rack densities for AI training and inference clusters are now routinely hitting 100 kilowatts per rack, and the trajectory is toward 200 to 300 kilowatts as the next hardware generation arrives. You cannot cool a 200 kilowatt rack with air. The physics simply does not support it. The heat flux density through the cabinet face is too high to extract with forced airflow at any commercially practical velocity. The real architectural decision for any gigawatt-scale AI facility being designed today is this. What fraction of your thermal management budget goes to direct liquid cooling, rear door heat exchangers, cold plates, manifold coolant distribution units, versus residual air handling for the balance of the room? And for the most thermally aggressive AI cluster configurations, full single-phase or two-phase immersion in dielectric fluid is increasingly on the table. Immersion eliminates the air handling problem entirely and can achieve power usage effectiveness ratios below 1.05. The trade-offs are real. Servicing hardware submerged in dielectric fluid is significantly more complex, and the capital cost of the tanks and fluid system is substantial. But the operational math is compelling. A facility running at PUE 1.05 versus 1.40 saves approximately 35% on cooling overhead power. At 9 gigawatts of IT load, that efficiency delta compounds into billions of dollars over a 15-year asset life. The developers who solve cooling architecture correctly before breaking ground will build a structural cost advantage that competitors cannot replicate by just swapping hardware. Here is the part of the story that receives almost no coverage in mainstream technology reporting, and it is arguably the most important constraint in the entire project. Grid interconnection. The approval you read in the headline has no direct relationship to whether the Western interconnection can physically absorb 9 gigawatts of new load at that location on any announced timeline. The current interconnection request queue in the Western U.S. is backlogged by 3 to 5 years minimum for projects of significant scale, and that estimate assumes no further deterioration in queue processing times, which have been getting worse, not better. Beyond the queue itself, 9 gigawatts is not a distribution-level problem or even a high-voltage substation upgrade problem. It requires new bulk transmission corridors, either high-voltage direct current lines or extra-high-voltage alternating current at the 345 kilovolt or 500 kilovolt level that themselves require 7 to 10 years of environmental permitting, land easement acquisition, and physical construction before a single electron flows. The fastest plausible path to grid power at this location would involve direct co-location adjacent to large existing generation assets with demonstrated spare capacity and a negotiated behind-the-meter arrangement that bypasses portions of the public queue. Even that path runs into FERC interconnection order timelines that routinely stretch beyond 36 months for material load additions. My honest read of the timeline math: a 9-gigawatt facility described in a 2024 or 2025 planning approval document will not operate at full rated capacity before 2033 at the earliest under optimistic assumptions. Projects that reach 500 megawatts to 1 gigawatt of live operational capacity by 2028 will be outperforming the industry baseline. Anyone projecting full 9-gigawatt utilization before 2030 is not modeling grid reality. They are modeling a press release. Let's close with a number that actually matters for anyone allocating capital. Building 9 gigawatts of hyperscale AI infrastructure from greenfield land to operational status is roughly a $90 to $120 billion capital program. That estimate uses current industry benchmarks of $10 to $13 million per megawatt for fully built-out, AI-optimized data center space, with liquid cooling infrastructure included. Add bulk transmission construction, call it $5 to $15 billion depending on how much of the grid build-out cost gets socialized through rate base versus borne directly by the developer. Land acquisition and senior water rights in a contested arid market, conservatively $500 million to $2 billion. Permitting, environmental compliance, interconnection study fees, and mitigation costs, another $1 to $3 billion. You are looking at a total capital stack somewhere between $100 and $140 billion for a project that will not reach full operational capacity for the better part of a decade. This is not a hyperscaler writing a single check from operating cash flow. This is a structured project finance program, senior debt tranches secured by offtake agreements, utility infrastructure cost-sharing arrangements, potential federal infrastructure loan guarantees, and phased equity commitment tied to milestone-based draws. For energy-focused investors watching this space, the cleanest opportunity structurally is not in the compute layer. It is in the generation and transmission layer that feeds these campuses. Utilities holding long-term service agreements, independent power producers with locked PPAs, and transmission-focused infrastructure funds are positioned to capture contractual, partially rate-regulated cash flows with a defined floor. The compute layer carries higher theoretical upside but also carries demand-side technology risk. If the AI infrastructure build-out cycle slows or the hardware efficiency curve shifts, the hyperscaler can defer hardware capex. The transmission line and the power plant cannot be deferred. They're already built. 9 gigawatts is a headline number that obscures a decade of engineering, legal, and capital formation work that has to happen before the first serious AI workload runs there at anything close to rated capacity. The projects that actually get built at scale will share one characteristic. They solved water rights before breaking ground, secured firm transmission capacity before announcing public timelines, and structured power contracts before committing construction capital. The projects that don't will be restructured in project finance court or quietly redeveloped at a fraction of the announced scale. If you are tracking this space seriously, the leading indicators are not press releases. They are interconnection queue position filings with FERC, state water rights adjudications, and utility integrated resource plan amendments. Those documents tell you what is actually being built. The approvals tell you what someone hopes to build. There is a significant gap between the two, and that gap is where the interesting analytical work lives. Subscribe if you want the next layer down on AI infrastructure economics. We go deep on every component of the stack.